Well, what a delight to be here again. I'm so pleased to see everyone enjoying themselves. Please kick up those red shoes. And I want to say that you deserve to have fun because I know that this community has done a lot of good and hard work, certainly over the years, and you've put it in supporting this field. Now, they asked me to both be motivating, funny, and do a historical overview, which Tom just did. So I'm just going to say that I think I'm going to focus on my personal experiences, and I want to say that I believe that the field has grown a great deal and will continue to do so, and it is my fervent belief that we will make progress and that we aim to thrive. So I come from Seattle, where early research on FAS and FASD and diagnosis, prevention, and treatment efforts took root, notice the metaphor, early on. And I was there as a student in the early 1980s. And I want to point out that even though they asked me to talk about the 1970s to 1990s, I was not there for that entire period. I was there as a student in the 1980s, so I met many of the early research pioneers, and in my travels to do community education all over the US, I met many early and deeply devoted advocates all over the country. So I can give you a historical overview on how the field of FASD has grown, but I would say that it is a story of how societal acceptance and awareness has grown over the years. So I'll start with Washington State as an example, and I'll include my experiences in a field that I really regard chose me. I'm not sure I chose it. So let me just start that in Washington State in 1968, there was a University of Washington pediatric resident trainee. Her name was Christy Uleland. She was working at our hospital, and she noticed that there was a group of children who had similar facial features. They had growth impairment, and they had developmental issues. And so she brought them together for a clinic that she actually couldn't attend, but her attending physicians were able to attend it. And through a series of explorations and scientific endeavors, and two very important papers that were both published in 1973, after examining these children, Dr. Ken Jones and Dr. David Smith, and then later another paper that added authors Dr. Christy Uleland and Dr. Ann Streisguth, who eventually was my mentor. These two papers introduced the term fetal alcohol syndrome and a clinical description of the impact of prenatal alcohol exposure, or PAE, in its most sort of obvious form. So then, as it did in other locations across the country, once people realized the challenge of fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, momentum just kept growing in Seattle and in Washington State for years. Recognition of FASD was followed by research on social drinking initiated in the 1970s to make sure that prenatal alcohol exposure, PAE, was really the issue. There was also basic science research using animal models. And I can tell you that I was part of the social drinking research. And if it gives you any idea, I had to test 200 14-year-olds. And there was one task that was a sustained attention task, and I had to keep poking myself to stay awake during the 15-minute task that the kids stayed awake for, but the examiner had trouble in the back of the room. I also, by the way, this research was funded by NAAA. We also carried out FASD education and prevention efforts. Those evolved from 1970s on, and I literally had to stick signs onto buses. We also did education for a wide variety of cultural groups, and Anne sent me off one day, Anne Streisguth, to drive to the farthest place you can go in the United States to the west at the invitation of a tribal nation to give a talk. The first statewide FASD diagnostic and prevention clinic network was started in 1993 by Claren and Ashley Hemingway. And guess what? I was there the very first day and for 21 years afterwards. FASD and related treatment programs developed in and just after the 1990s by those of us who wanted to know what the heck you do after diagnosis. And that's when I really jumped in and began to cultivate my research and clinical interests. It started with CDC inviting me to give a 10-minute talk on if treatment could be done. So I showed up and gave a 2-hour talk on how treatment could be done. And then we workshopped it for another couple of hours. And the truth was that these treatment ideas were informed by families, by listening to families. More about that in a moment. So the field has flourished in our state. These treatment ideas have continued to sprout and spread over the years. And as you know, the field has flourished and grown in other locations throughout the nation and internationally. So on a personal basis, I want to tell you that living experience was so important throughout that growth in Washington State. Remember that this founding era, so the 70s through the 90s, and even when I was there in the 80s, email was still a rare occurrence. In fact, my email doesn't even have my name in it, if that gives you any idea. People wrote letters. Newsletters were in hard copy. And as a student, I sat in a small desk crammed between filing cabinets that were overflowing with letters, including letters from Michael Doris, that people had written to Anne Streisguth about their families, their troubles, their requests, their desires, their joys, their pain. All our research was informed by family stories. And children, teenagers, young adults, families came to our research office. And we listened. Anne wrote with a blue Sharpie on page after page after page after page of stories. I remember so many stories I wish I could tell you. They've stayed with me. And some were so joyous, and most, frankly, were so hard. But beyond Washington State, much more went on nationally and internationally, and there are so many people who were part of that growth whom I would like to acknowledge. But for time's sake, I can't. But together, as a community, we remember all who have contributed. Okay, now I'm going to do the history part. So centering on the US and on certain key milestones, here's the history. In 1981, the first US Surgeon General advisory on alcohol and pregnancy was issued in the FDA Drug Bulletin, Progress. As the 1980s progressed, Kathy Mitchell became a pioneering advocate in the field, speaking openly about alcohol use in pregnancy. As told to me briefly put, her daughter received an FASD diagnosis, and she testified and was a key witness for the Alcoholic Beverage and Labeling Act. The act passed in 1988, and a clear message was required about alcohol's potential health hazards, and it was required for display on all alcohol beverage containers. In 1990, no FASD began. living experience had another voice. In 1992, Senator Ted Kennedy authorized language appropriating funding for FAS and authorizing a really important thing, the Institute of Medicine report on the full fetal alcohol spectrum. And this was groundbreaking because then things went beyond just fetal alcohol syndrome. In 1996 also began the Interagency Coordinating Council on FASD, the ICC FASD. And this council brought together decision makers from multiple federal agencies to make things happen. And Sally Anderson, who I'd like to acknowledge tonight, was one of the individuals who later made ICC FASD so productive as it continues to be. And as Tom was saying, to round out this overview of the founding era in 1998, along came legislation sponsored by Tom Daschle and his co-sponsors such as Senator Frank Murkowski. And among other aims, that legislation provided CDC with a line item appropriation for a public health component that led to creation of the FAS-FAE task force, which somehow I was appointed to, which among other achievements led to the call for action, which FASD United is currently updating. But in this founding era, the Parent Support and Advocacy Network was already there, speaking up, making living experience known, and it too began to flourish and grow.